This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. The older I get, the more fascinating the subject of memory becomes. Because not only do you have to know more, memorize more, think about all the different things that have happened in your life as you continue to age, but now we're in the information explosion age. So much information coming at us constantly, nonstop. I mean, ever since Netscape went public, the summer of 1995, it was just game on. Here comes the information. Now what do you do with it? Now what do you remember? How do you access it? How do you use it to make better decisions or worse decisions? What types of illusions do our memories create? I love this stuff. My guest today also loves this subject. Christopher Chabris is an American research psychologist, currently the Associate Professor of Psychology and co-director of the Neuroscience program at Union College. He is best known as the co-author, along with Daniel Simons, who has appeared on my podcast, of the bestseller, The Invisible Gorilla. Check out the video again on YouTube if you've not seen it. Christopher brings a wide take on what's going on in our minds. All the different examples and perspectives coming together to give us a better picture of how we think, how we decide, how we don't decide, how we get confused. Really interesting stuff. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Christopher Chabris. Here you are, a guy who's a cognitive psychologist. You're right there looking at memory and attention all day long, and we're going to dive into that. But I was thinking about the notion of memory and witnesses and the legal system. Witnesses, oh my gosh. I mean, when you really start to look at some of the work that you've been involved in, our legal system is on a foundation that is, at best, not solid. If eyewitness testimony is part of our foundation that we all accept, but then when you dive into the guys like yourself that are doing work and research into memory, I mean, it's a crapshoot, isn't it?
I wouldn't say it's a crapshoot. I mean, I think the foundation of the legal system, as I understand it, not being a legal scholar myself, but my understanding is that the foundation is evidence, and there are different kinds of evidence, right? So I think what we're learning from cognitive psychology research really it's been building over the last 100 years, our understanding of this, or even more than 100 years, almost 150 years now, is that memory is not as accurate and objective and permanent and detailed as we think it is. And so I don't think that turns things into a crapshoot, but it does mean we should reduce the value we place on, a single confident eyewitness as enough to convict someone. And we should probably increase the role of telling juries and telling judges about the science of memory in the courtroom. There are still many jurisdictions in the United States and probably other countries too, although I have even less knowledge of those, where judges and laws explicitly state that what people think about how memory works is just common sense knowledge that the jury has no business being instructed on by experts, unlike gunpowder residue or DNA or, any of the other things that, you would think you would have expert testimony on. The way memory works is not one of those things. So we need to fix that. We need to put a little less weight on it. But I think also we need to sort of start to come up with better techniques for figuring out the truth when memories are disputed. And that could be a really hard challenge, but there might be a research program there. There may be people working on it already, but that would be a good way forward now that we know that memory has lots of problems.
It's funny you make the analogy to DNA. I remember his first name was Barry. I think the research guy that was the DNA guy in the OJ case that came to claim, and the Innocence Project, I think it was called. But so basically, I don't know if you just said this, but I'm curious if this is true. I would not be able to call you as an expert witness to question memory and to talk about memory and how it works from a scientific standpoint. And from what we know, that's kind of off limits, or is that because it seems like it opens a Pandora's box to bring you in as an expert witness?
I would say don't count on being able to use me to get off for whatever crime you commit.
Come on, I was not implying that. You know where I was going.
It really would. My understanding is that most crimes are state crimes in the U.S. and each state has their own rules about what evidence can be admitted and under what circumstances experts can be allowed to testify and what they're allowed to say and not say. So it would really depend on where. Now, to try to sort of fix that problem, the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. commissioned an expert panel to review all of the science and literature on eyewitness testimony and victim identification of suspects in crimes and so on. There's a huge ton of research on this stuff. And the panel came up with recommendations to try to minimize, false identification, false conviction. What are the best practices that the police should use when they run lineups in the police station, all the way up to how witness testimony should be viewed and so on. And hopefully the fact that that's coming from a national body of scientific experts will have some influence, but it'll take a long time for the legal system to adjust to this.
I hope you don't mind. You have got your hands in so many different elements. I think they're all related from your perspective to outsiders that might feel a little disparate. But I know you had some interest in, I guess the best way to describe it is the play that changed poker. And I would love for you to kind of describe that story, the bluff, so to speak. But I don't know if you're a football fan, if you might want to connect it, or if you followed at all the end of the Super Bowl where the Patriots coach did not call a timeout. That's been deemed a mighty big bluff as well. But either way, if you might want to jump into that story.
It's funny you ask that, because it really does seem to me sometimes that I do work and think about a lot of different areas. In some cases, many of which I'm not a true expert in, but I think that's part of the beauty of cognitive science and cognitive psychology and thinking about how the mind works, because the more you know about it, the more you see how these ideas apply to, pretty much every decision we make and every realm of life, sports coaching, the law, medicine, what policy should be, everything. So let me see if I can connect those two things. Well, the play that changed poker was a column that I wrote for the Wall Street Journal. They're having me do a little monthly column on games, and the first one was about poker. I wanted to write about this play that was in the final table of the 2004 World Series of Poker. So this is the famous tournament where everyone pays $10,000 to play. Oddly enough, the entry fee has remained unchanged since the early 1970s, even though the value of $10,000 has declined a lot over that time. At the final table, there were prizes of millions of dollars at stake for the top finishers. And at one point, Dan Harrington, who was former champion in 1995 and had been to the final table in 2003. Now it's 2004. He's at the final table again. Itself a remarkable accomplishment, just getting there, by one of the greatest players ever. He was dealt a really awful hand, a 2 and a 6. In Hold'em poker, you get 2 private cards, and the rest of the cards are dealt face up over several rounds of betting. And there was a raise in front of him, and someone called that raise, and Dan looks at his 2 and a 6, which is, an automatic throwaway for 99.9% of the players, 99.9% of the time. Instead, Dan made a huge raise, and raised it to $1 million, I think, from something like 200,000 was the previous bet. This caused all the other players in the hand to fold, even though everybody else had a better hand than him. There's almost no worse hand you can have than a 2 and a 6. A massive bluff, of course, but it's a particular kind of bluff. It's not just sort of randomly making a huge bet just to, force people out because they're scared. It's betting when you think, bluffing when you think your bluff is going to have a very good chance of success. It was a really calculated bluff. And in fact, it had been a bluff that really good poker players knew about for a long time. It's called the squeeze play, because the idea is that the person who raised first is now kind of squeezed in between your big raise and the guy who called after him. So it's the game theory sort of dynamics of it make it very hard for either of those players to stay in the hand, unless for some reason, they have ESP and they know exactly what you're doing. And it's a really, sort of beautiful play. And the reason why I think it changed poker was that it was televised. And so everyone who watched that hand later on ESPN saw that he was raising with a 2 and a 6. And if they had just seen that hand and not known what cards he had, everyone would have assumed that he had a pair of aces or a pair of kings or some other ultra strong hand, and it would have been a nothing play. It would have been, one guy raises, another guy calls, a third guy must have the nuts, and he makes a big raise, and everybody else folds. That would not even make TV. And I think the reason it changed poker is that everybody saw what the pros were doing at that point, and they got a much wider view of how bluffs could be logical and reasonable, and they weren't just sort of massive psychological exercises in scaring people away, but they had a logic to them. And that's increasingly influenced how poker is played since then. Switching to football, the thing that I noticed most about that play at the end of the Super Bowl, which I did see, was how everybody thinks that Pete Carroll, the Seahawks coach, made a horrible decision. There has been less praise that I've noticed of Belichick for not calling timeout, although there's been criticism of him for that. Like, why didn't he call timeout? That's the normal thing to do.
That's the bluff right there, the normal thing to do, just like in the poker example you just described.
Exactly. You could call it a bluff, or you could call it a just sort of like an attempt to unsettle the opponent. By not doing what they expect you to do, you force them to rethink or to hurry up or to do something that they might not have been planning to do. So even if it doesn't come under the category of bluff, it certainly comes under the category, I guess, of doing the unexpected, and that can often be a good thing. Incidentally, as an aside, there's a great video on the internet, on YouTube, called something like Driscoll Middle School Trick Play. And what it is this team that lines up, this middle school football team that lines up, and the quarterback sort of walks around, behind the center and starts shouting some signals to the other players. And then the center just hands him the ball around the side of his leg rather than snapping it in between his legs the way they normally do. He just hands it around the side of his leg, and the quarterback just takes a walk right through the defensive line. And once he's in the secondary, he starts running and gets to the end zone. And it's a great play of, violating great example of violating expectations. The defense has no idea what's going on until he's, too far for them to stop. So Belichick, not quite like that, but still, he's, obviously known for doing unusual things.
I thought too, on the Belichick example, I don't know if you pondered this one as well. It helped perhaps Belichick to have lost 2 Super Bowls in insane fashion, to have that in his hip pocket as a way to make that call. I mean, you almost wonder, would the average coach, or the coach getting there for the first time, would he have gone completely against the common way and done something as, quote, ballsy, perhaps, as what Belichick did?
Yeah, that's a really good point I hadn't thought of. If this is, the 6th time, you've already won a few, you've already lost a couple, maybe the pressure is off. That's why they always say it's good to be there for the second time. And there aren't that many people who you could really say legitimately have expertise in, that kind of high pressure play calling. He's one of the few coaches probably, at that level, obviously, who have that. Who knows what goes on in his head? I think it would be a fascinating psychological study by itself.
But you make a great point there too, in the sense that to him, perhaps that decision making was quite rational, quite simple, and he was very calm, and he saw all the choices in his mind. But to us, we're all sitting there going, what an idiot. He didn't call timeout. He's not giving Brady time to go down and win it. But he's in a different place than we are.
Yeah, and for all I know, he's prepared for those kinds of things. One difference between the true masters in any field, and this has been studied in chess and music and lots of others, and bringing it a little bit back to something I actually know about, as opposed to football, is that the true experts, the true grandmasters, spend more time studying and preparing, and they have spent more time studying and preparing, throughout their careers. So I would not at all be surprised if at some point, Belichick had written down, a bunch of scenarios. The opponents are up by 4 points, on the 1 yard line with a minute left.
Right.
What do we do? He may have had some, but maybe he didn't have it like, taped to his arm the way the quarterbacks used to, but it maybe in his head someplace, or some kind of assistant had a chart or something. I mean, who knows? I mean, that's the kind of level of preparation, though, that the true grandmasters have. Chess grandmasters, they know some openings out to 30 moves. This is kind of that kind of thing. Another revolution in poker, by the way, that I didn't get to write about, although maybe I will sometime, is when players started calculating actual odds of, hand versus hand, basically doing sort of exhaustive calculations of probabilities in order to memorize their actions in advance for certain situations, or at least memorize what the optimal play would be for certain situations. Then they would know whether they should, choose the optimal play, or maybe choose something that, wouldn't be optimal, but might exploit their opponent's actions a little bit more. Nobody did that until, I would say, the 90s or something like that, starting in the mid 90s maybe. And that was a big difference. So maybe this is just sort of a new level of preparation, and he had sort of thought that through in advance.
Yeah, I'd had a conversation a few years back, an interview with a guy named Chris Ferguson, nicknamed Jesus.
No, he's the guy. Yeah. He's the guy I was talking about.
Yeah,
he did that.
Absolutely. He was right there. And I tell you a fun story. I've actually got him on videotape in the same room where we have the model hold the carrot, and he throws the playing card from like 6 feet away and cuts the carrot in half. And the name of the book is Cards as Weapons by Ricky Jay, I believe. Fantastic to see that in person, by the way.
Yeah, I've only seen it on TV. Unfortunately, Chris Ferguson sort of wound up and admired in all the scandal of his of his poker site afterwards. But another guy who figured out the same thing at the same time was Andy Block, who was another poker professional, MIT graduate, Harvard Law graduate. Very intellectual and disciplined approach to the game. Would make a lot of plays that seemed kind of odd at the time. This is maybe like the early 2000s, because he was ahead of his time in a lot of ways like that. He had done the same work that Chris Ferguson had, sort of independently. A lot of games, and football is a good example, I think, might be strategically deeper than people realize. The announcers sometimes say, well, it's a chess game out there. It may be more of a poker game, than a chess game sometimes. And it may be a situation more where advanced planning can actually help.
Let me jump into chess since you bring it up. Correct me if I'm wrong. You've been a chess master. You can define that since 1986. So that would that mean you were at that level by the age of 20?
Yes, which is not that special anymore. I mean, there's just a guy, an American, who became one of the youngest grandmasters ever, which is about 3 or 4 levels higher than master, and he's 13.
Here's where I wanted to go with that, though. So what can you tell the audience as someone who, obviously, that's a tremendous amount of time that you dedicated in your life to playing chess, and now here you are looking at memory. What did that dedication, that single-mindedness to chess, what did it teach you about memory?
It's funny that you say that I was dedicated and single-minded, because at the time it didn't feel that way. I actually felt, as I can recall it, memory being imperfect as it is, but as I recall it, I felt that my focus on chess kind of went up and down over the course of about 7 or 8 years, maybe 8 or 9 years between when I started playing in tournaments and when I reached master. It was really nine years it took, I guess. And I felt my dedication going quite up and down. And in fact, when I started college, then that distracted, me quite a bit. But I guess if you look back on it, compared to most other things I was doing, I was spending an awful lot of time on chess. It was one of my, main pursuits. I think the research lesson, chess has been studied a lot by cognitive psychologists, and it was called, early on back in the 50s, Alan Newell and Herb Simon, who were the pioneers of both cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence, called it the Drosophila, the fruit fly of artificial intelligence. It's also been a fruit fly for cognitive psychology and for memory research. It's taught us that experts, masters in a domain, don't have superior memories in general. They're not sort of memory savants who can just remember anything you tell them and tell you, any day of the week for the past 1,000 years or whatever. But that the continued study and practice builds up structures in memory that let you remember more and more complex things. And it's an automatic process. You don't sort of study memorization to get better. You practice the art, or the sport, and your memory comes along for the ride. And in turn, it enables you to do higher and higher, greater and greater levels of performance.
Let me shift into something slightly different on memory. Not really different, but just another example to kind of bring the audience into where you go. And like I said from the beginning, you cover a lot of different territory, but it all works back to the thread of your world and your life. I wouldn't describe it as picking a fight, but I think some people might initially have thought, wow, that's pretty aggressive. And you brought up a memory example with what many people would consider one of the brightest guys on TV, an astrophysicist named Neil Tyson, who is the host of a show named Cosmos that a lot of people like, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't think you had any, from everything that I've read, I don't think you had any particular agenda, but you smartly used a memory issue of his to illustrate a point, and it all ended well. But why don't you talk about that and how that came to be? Describe the story to the audience. It was terribly interesting.
It's funny that you asked about that, because right now, as we speak, there's yet another case of people with potentially false memories being criticized for it, which is the news anchor Brian Williams from NBC.
Yeah, we can go into that one too after.
We'll get to him. We'll get to him shortly. But Neil Tyson is an extremely smart guy, right? So he's got a PhD in. Still is the scientific director of the Hayden Planetarium, I think, and is one of the most visible popularizers of science. I mean, I don't know how he keeps up the schedule of all of his talks and appearances, and he's even got his own talk show now in the U.S. And in several of his speeches, he had been saying, basically making a side point about science literacy. One of his big crusades is science literacy and how Americans don't know enough about science and ought to know more about science and so on. And he said, he remembered watching George W. Bush as president after 9/11, in his speech after 9/11, say, "Our God is the God who named the stars." I think that's a direct quote, but it's pretty close to what he said Bush said. And Tyson went on to say, you know, if Bush were more aware of the history of science, he would realize that it was actually the Arabs and Muslim countries a millennium ago that were the leaders in astronomy and many other areas of science, and they're the ones who actually named about 2/3 of the stars. You know, Bush, said this in an attempt to divide Christians from Muslims, Americans from Arab countries, and so on. He sort of made this side point about how Bush was fomenting religious intolerance and bigotry as part of his larger point of science literacy and knowing about the history of science and discovery and so on. And he had been saying that Tyson had been saying this in several speeches, I think. I don't know how many, but it was sort of one of his standard bits for his public talks. And sometime last fall, a writer for a right-leaning political website in the U.S. called The Federalist, his name was Sean Davis, I believe, pointed out in his column or in his article online that Bush never actually said that. In fact, when he said our God is the God who named the stars, he was talking in 2003, 2 whole years later, about the heroism of the astronauts who lost their lives in the space shuttle explosion. And he was basically trying to say something unifying, not divisive. It had nothing to do with Islam, with terrorism, with Arab countries, with anything like that. And Davis pointed this out. Also pointed out a few other sort of times that Tyson's memory has said contradictory things. Now that was where sort of the story background. Now the question is, when you're a public figure and your mistakes have been pointed out like that, how do you respond? Tyson's initial response was not that good. He said, well, I remember seeing Bush say it, so he must have said it. By the way, it's easy for memory to forget things we've seen, but it's hard for memory to make up things we haven't seen. And at that point, I said, wow, why is he taking this, tack? The documentation is out there. There are transcripts of these speeches. You can Google them very easily. They're on page 1 if the right Google search terms get put in. He wasn't saying anything, and I was a little bit, the thing that struck me about it was that it was actually a very sharp accusation he was making of Bush. To say that someone was trying to create religious division and intolerance is a pretty nasty criticism. I said to, one morning I woke up and I saw a story about this or something, and I said, I'll just send a tweet about this. So I tweeted, at Neil Tyson, why don't you just apologize, to President Bush for getting it wrong and then move on? And to my surprise, in 5 minutes, he wrote back and said, that's what I'm going to do. And then a couple of days later, he did. And so Dan Simons and I, Dan is my co-author on The Invisible Gorilla, our book, we decided to write up this sort of case as an example of, two things. One, how fallible memory can be. I mean, here was a smart guy, an educated guy. He's got a PhD. He speaks all the time. And yet he had a complete conflation of two memories. He remembered something Bush said in 2003 after the space shuttle exploded and ascribed it to what he said in 2001 after 9/11. Just completely combined two different memories into one, and then went forward assuming that this was exactly what happened. Apparently didn't check his sources. Apparently, didn't respond at first when people pointed out he was wrong. Memory can be so compelling and so vivid that we don't bother to check it. So our memories are much more fallible than we think. When we're confronted with evidence that our memories are wrong, we should really take that seriously and respond more appropriately. And that's what politicians should do, especially. This happens to politicians all the time. Brian Williams, it really can happen to anybody. It's not some sort of feature of mental illness or anything like that. It's just part of how memory works, and people ought to be aware of it.
Well, as you mentioned, and it's great lessons for all of us, because here we are talking about Neil Tyson, Brian Williams, two very smart guys, very successful on the TV quite a bit. They've got fame. They've got fame at extraordinary levels. But for all of us mere mortals, it sure says something about humility, about our own knowledge, doesn't it?
It does. And that's a general, that's a good point you make, because it's a general trait of humans, at least humans in the present day, the ones we can study right now, to be overconfident in their own skills and abilities and overestimate their own knowledge and think that their own memories are, more accurate and permanent than they really are, and so on. That's sort of a large part of the theme of our book, is not so much humility, but knowing that, what we think about how our minds work is systematically wrong and tends to be biased in the direction, in the positive direction of thinking we're doing better than we actually are. And some people say, well, that's good, because, otherwise you'd be depressed if you realize the reality of, the fallibility of your mind and so on. But I'm not so sure, because we make all kinds of decisions, based on these illusions. Think of how many people think that they know where the stock market is going to go, or know where the price of, futures is going to go, or how many people are absolutely certain that some guy, was the criminal when they aren't, or, it's on and on. I firmly believe that having a more accurate, or as we sometimes say, better calibrated understanding of our own abilities and our own, mental capacities would be a good thing.
It's interesting you bring up the stock market and forecasting, the notion of prediction. As a guy who's been involved in that world a little bit, I go back to, let's say, the mid 1990s and roll forward to today. So there's a 20-year window. And for anyone that's got enough perspective to think about that 20-year window, boy, has the stock market been one wild ride. Have bond markets been a wild ride? Currency's a wild ride. Oil up and down multiple times. I mean, bailouts, banks going bust. I mean, so much has happened in 20 years. So the question I have for you as a cognitive psychologist, when somebody comes on Bloomberg or CNBC and they've got the daily prediction, the daily forecast, why in the world, after the last 20 years, are we still paying attention to anybody that purports to have the ability to predict tomorrow?
I'll answer that question, but first I'm going to answer the question I thought you were going to ask, which is how should we react when we see someone like that? And I was going to say we should laugh.
Wow, there you go.
But I think you already laughed for me. I think this reveals a couple of things. One, people like to make predictions. Two, people like to listen to predictions, and that probably reflects something fairly deep about our psychology. I won't try to make up a story right now because I don't have a good one. But I think there's probably a good story. Maybe someone's already figured it out about why we find predictions so appealing. The third point is that one thing I know that we find appealing is the confidence of other people, right? So a lot of the people who come on and make predictions, even if they wanted to make tentative predictions, it often seems to me like the hosts or the show or the producers or whatever either encourage them to not make tentative predictions or not to describe their uncertainty, or, no matter what they say, they put it in a text box at the bottom of the screen where it's much more simplified, and into something much more, absolute and definitive. And of course, we know, there's tons of research about how difficult to impossible it is to predict most things. And yet we keep on paying for predictions and paying attention to predictions. And I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are set up to find confidence extremely appealing. And that's an illusion in a lot of the cases, because although confident people might be right, a little more often than unconfident people, there is some truth to confidence, right? There's some reality to confidence. The correlation between confidence and accuracy, or confidence and truth, is much lower than we pretend it is, than we act like it is.
I think it's a great point about the confidence. I hadn't really thought about it from that particular angle as to what pulls us in, what makes us want to pay attention. And if
I'll give you an example. Jim Cramer, who's on CNBC, or at least used to be, I haven't looked lately. Every night he had this show. I forget the name of it, but basically the show consists of him taking phone calls. Someone will say, "Well, what do you think of IBM right now?" And he will spout off a few statistics about IBM. They're probably true. I don't know. I've never fact checked them. And then he'll tell you whether to buy or sell. And when he tells you to buy, he has this sound effect that says buy, buy, buy. And when he tells you to sell, he has a sound effect that says sell, sell, sell. And it's hard to imagine a more overconfident expression of opinions. He listens for 2 seconds, opines for 8 seconds, and then shouts at you, basically. The whole show is based on this confidence illusion. I think that's the whole appeal of it.
And that works. That works because the people that watch or they're paying attention know that he has a very serious background of where he was a successful fund manager. So the fact that the successful fund manager now comes out and puts on something very similar to perhaps a cartoon type show, that we make this jump that the guy that was running the serious hedge fund with none of the theatrics now does the theatrics. And this really, are we supposed to really believe that that's how he made his decisions for his hedge fund? I don't think so.
It's hard to imagine that that's what he was actually doing. But I'm pretty sure that he wasn't watching call-in shows and making the decisions by doing what people on call-in shows tell him to do.
There you go.
It's obviously, like, that's a show which has entertainment value, and what one doesn't know how many of his audience are actually slavishly following his investment recommendations and so on. But I have never heard him on that show say, you should buy index funds, and buy, index funds diversified across world markets, and just, wait until you need the money, which is sort of the standard investment advice that, that sober people will give you, in light of the fact that it really is impossible for, me, Christopher Chabris, to form a better, opinion about the direction of markets or of particular stocks even, than other people who were in the market at the same time.
Hey, Christopher, as we wind down, let me get you to dig into a couple more quick issues. I mean, we could talk all day. All these issues that we're bringing up, you and I both know could expand out for hours and hours and hours. We don't have that. But in terms of intuition, us human beings, we've really still not wrapped our arms around the idea that our intuitions are often not that great, not that reliable. And, guys like Daniel Kahneman have gone down that path with some great work. But talk about the notion of intuition, because there has been some work, there's been some popular reading out there, that the notion of the snap judgments and heuristics, and just make a quick judgment and don't have to take all the time in. Talk about that, because there have been some psychologists out there, some work done for guys like Gerd Gigerenzer, who talks about some really interesting examples with heuristics. From your perspective, how do you see that subject area?
Well, first thing I should say is that Gerd Gigerenzer is a genius and an amazing psychologist and researcher, but I don't think what he's done supports the notion that deciding to trust your gut rather than go with some kind of analytical course of thinking is a good idea. I think what he has shown is that often the there are simple heuristics, simple decision rules that yield pretty good performance, sort of better performance than you would think, given how brain dead these rules seem to be. And that you can get a lot of mileage out of simple rules. But that doesn't mean that you can get more mileage out of simple rules all the time than complex rules. Sometimes simple rules outperform complex rules when the complex rules are using a lot of information, which is just noise. So, complex decision rules about markets, which take into account all kinds of things which are just basically random numbers, are going to make a lot of mistakes. And a simple strategy like buy and hold as long as you can, which is a very informationally simple strategy, could beat a more complex strategy. You just have to imagine buying an index fund versus a managed mutual fund. Mutual fund managers, in essence, are following very complex strategies that use lots of information, but they can't beat the market on average. So I think he's entirely right there. The problem is sort of turning it into a general prescription or theory of life and decision making. And that's what some people think that people like Malcolm Gladwell have done. And I'm absolutely certain that people like Oprah Winfrey have done that. Oprah Winfrey is not a name that comes up often, in decision-making research, but she's a decision-making guru for lots of people. And she published a whole issue of her magazine about the history of intuition. And she wrote an editorial about how, she's always listened to the voice of her intuition and it's never been wrong. And, and so on. And unfortunately, this celebration of intuition that you see in books like Blink by Malcolm Gladwell and in Oprah stuff and other things, I think is mostly a sort of it's basically a statistical illusion. And the way it works is you go back and you find times or situations or stories where someone had a feeling that something was going to happen, or someone had a feeling that a certain thing was the case. They weren't sure, but they had a feeling, and they acted on that feeling, and they turned out to be right. And you can find many, many, many examples of this. Now, of course, a lot of the time they are after the fact saying, "Oh yeah, I trusted my gut." We're not inside their head at the time when they made the decision, so we don't really know what all the factors were. But even taking them at face value and saying, 100%, I went with my gut on this thing and I was right. The statistical illusion is that we aren't being shown all the times that people went with their guts and failed or died or lost their money. Nor are we being shown the times when people did some analysis and reflection before they made their decision and were right. And without looking at these other kinds of cases, you will get a completely misleading impression of whether going with your gut is a generally, good strategy or wise counsel. My general opinion is that as the world is getting more and more complex, our intuitions, which are sort of, based on, let's say, heuristics, to use Guy Grenzer's word, or considerations that applied, at times in our distant evolutionary past, the modern world is much different from the world of hunter-gatherers or from the world of our, animal ancestors. So I think it's going to become increasingly not a good idea to trust intuition as time moves on and things get more complicated. I mean, look at the financial crisis, right? And you can find a lot of quotes where people said, I didn't really understand these things, but everybody else was doing it, so I went with it. Well, that's an intuition. That's an instinct, right? Your gut said, everybody else is doing it, I better do it too. We saw what that led to.
I should add, I've had Gerd on my podcast twice. He's great. And I always tell people I don't know how well it's done, but his newest book, Risk Savvy, is fabulous. It's right on the money.
I have his book, but I haven't read it yet. But I can recommend very strongly one of his previous books, his 2007 book, whose name doesn't come to me right now, but it's a great book that I've assigned to my students.
Was it Simple Heuristics? I think it might have been Simple Heuristics. No,
it wasn't that. It was a smaller sort of. He's got a lot of books. They're all good, but this was sort of a smaller one that I really especially like. I'm in my office right now, but I don't think I have it right on the shelf, so I can't.
No worries. Hey, let me get one last quick idea from you, because we were talking about the complexity of life moving forward and how intuition is. I'm working on a new project right now, a new book project, and I'm finding, after having my first book come out like 10 years ago, now with a certain amount of experience of doing this, the desire to reach into so many buckets, the information flow that comes to us as individuals today. And here you are, a guy that's spending much of your life looking at memory. I feel like I'm tapped out. I mean, I don't know how much longer or how much more memory. I mean, to me, it feels like we're more in an age of where you have to navigate where the depositories of certain information might lie, and you have to have memory of that. But trying to memorize or trying to think of memory in a way where you can comprehend everything that's coming at us, and it seemingly is expanding exponentially on whatever time frame you might want to describe it. But talk about memory and the influx of information coming at us. It's got to be, it's a challenge, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's also a seduction, right? Because there's some really nice experiments, and another book to be recommended is The Compass of Pleasure by David Linden, who's a neuroscientist, and he mentions in that book some experiments that show that monkeys will perform work. Like, I think, pressing buttons or something like that, in order to get little bits of information about what they're going to see next on a screen. So information even is rewarding, at a sort of a fundamental level to our close, primate relatives. And we can see from the success of Twitter and Facebook and Google and so on that information is probably, extremely rewarding to humans also. And good reasons for that, probably. And, again, distant evolutionary past, forecasting the future, there was very little way to do that. So any kind of information about what's going to happen was of extreme value. It's probably now a situation where, just like, calories, we've got too much of it too easily obtained to be optimal for our brains. That doesn't mean it's not a good thing that there's so much information. It actually is a good thing, because we can learn more, we can understand more, we can invent more. We can solve more problems with more information. But for the individual, living in that environment, I think it is a challenge. Nassim Taleb is someone who talks about this sometimes. Don't read the news, right? Because the news is mostly actually noise in the long run. The news of what happened this hour as opposed to last hour and next hour and today as opposed to yesterday very rarely is of any consequence, 6 months or 2 years down the road. So it's mostly sort of time wasted if your goal is to develop a more accurate understanding of, let's say, how the world works and a better way to sort of, make your own decisions in life. Being too swayed by the last bit of information you heard or the last bit of news and so on is not a good strategy. So hard as it might be, I think sometimes it's good to disengage from that kind of, information flow and seek out, other sources.
Yeah. I have to say, as a guy in my mid-40s, I'm glad that I'm able to see both sides of it, so I can still remember pre-internet and now post-internet, so I can at least have some perspective. I sometimes wonder what it must be like to be 18 or 25 and you've just had information thrown at you nonstop your entire life. It's got to feel overwhelming. Hey, Chris, where can we send people? So the book is The Invisible Gorilla. It's everywhere. You've got, so many millions of YouTube video views. It's insane. It's kind of like, it's really nuts, right? Millions and millions and millions.
Our video of the people passing basketballs, which is called Selective Attention Test on YouTube, is, it's been much more successful than anything that we ever expected. I think when we did it it was actually a class experiment, and for a course we were teaching 15 years ago. So it's been tremendously successful and fun. You can learn all about it at theinvisiblegorilla.com, and a lot of my articles are linked to from Chabris.com. Chabris.com? Correct.
See, you're good. You're like me. I got my last name too. I paid some Russian guy $600 for my last name about 10 years ago. So
nobody had my last name when I got it way back when.
So, hey, listen, Chris, thank you for taking some time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Take care. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video.
But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.